Thank you all for coming. Before I get into the talk, my first question is to you guys. What are you looking to get out of this talk? Why are you here? Anybody?
Ideas for documentation structure.
Ideas for documentation structure, okay. I might have to switch to a live demo for that one then.
Ideas on how to ensure that the documentation continues to be maintained after initial release.
Okay, maintaining the documentation after initial release. I have got something in there for that. Okay, anybody else? What are you here for? What are you looking to get out of this?
Well, I don't document stuff.
You don't document stuff.
So this seemed like a good idea to actually get me.
Okay, right. I've got a lot in about that. I kind of expected that would be the case, which leads nicely on to why I'm giving this talk. So, I've been doing software for a very, very long time. I started programming back in the 80s. So I've been programming 35 years this year at some point. Now I feel old saying that. But I've been doing this a long time. And when I started, there wasn't a lot of documentation. There was very, very little. I remember in the 90s building network software for Novell NetWare. And this is pre-TCP IP. This is IPX, if anyone's ever used the IPX network protocol. And this is all running on DOS. And you had to disassemble the software to figure out how to use the network because it was completely undocumented. Same in the 80s when we were working on BBC Model Bs and Acorn came along. They had some documentation, but all the interesting stuff was undocumented. And that's where I first got into documentation, because we would have to write this down for each other in order to get things done. We had to take stuff apart, and after that, we'd have to then share what we'd learned with everybody else on the team in order to get things done. So that's where I originally came from with documentation, and I've been writing documentation for as long as I've been programming, pretty much. But my other motive is documentation is something that hasn't changed over the decades. There's been a lot of fashions in the industry and a lot of things reinvented, repeated, rediscovered. Take your pick on that phrase. Fashions come and fashions go, but the fundamentals, they stay the same. The things that people need stay the same. And one of those things is documentation. So what I want to cover in today's talk, why do docs matter? And that's a lot of the talk, trying to convince people to write documentation in the first place. I'm going to talk about some of the specific reasons why I get benefit from writing documentation. I'm going to write about what to document, and I'm going to look at some tools as well to encourage you to document. And along there, I'll be answering Rob's question about how to continue to maintain documentation once you've started writing it. Please ask questions as you go, especially with a small audience like this. My talks tend to be far more two-way than me stood up here lecturing. Because at the end of the day, I'm not saying I know better than you. I'm up here telling you what I've seen with my career. And you can go online, you can Google me, you can see who I've worked for, what I've done over the last 20 odd years. And I'm bringing that experience to you guys. I don't know what you've done. Some of you may have done even better stuff than I've done, and that would be awesome. So it's a way for me to learn from you as well, which is why I do these things. So why do docs matter? I think we've all almost answered this, but anyway. When you're going out there and using documentation written by other people, what is that? What are you using? What documentation have you read today, this week? Anybody?
Wiki.
Wiki? What kind of wiki? For what?
Normally it's GitHub Wiki.
GitHub Wiki, okay.
Or comments in the code.
Comments in the code, right. Anybody else? Have anyone else read any documentation this week?
Yeah, Stripes documentation.
Stripes documentation, okay. Got something a bit more about that kind of thing later on. I think you'll like that. Anybody else? Has anyone not used any documentation this week at all? Okay, so not even the PHP manual. Wow. Okay, I mean, I've got the PHP manual open. I've got a tab in every browser window I've got, and I've got a ridiculous amount of browser windows.
Most of the week off.
You've had the week off.
I did read a reading this week.
That's still documentation. Still documentation. Now, the docs you've used, what do you like about them? Why are you using them?
Strive's really easy.
Okay.
They give you examples as well.
Mm-hmm.
The request and the response.
Okay, yep.
So it's fairly straightforward, and the SDK is easy to read as well.
Okay. So,
Fastest way to get your response.
sorry?
Fastest way to get the answer.
Fastest way to get the answer. And with the Stripe stuff, it's the fact they've got all those examples, and I believe they've got examples in multiple languages as well, haven't they?
Yeah.
So you can select between them. Yep.
Provide the car example as well.
Yep.
As well, with, like you said, different languages.
Yeah. Yeah, so with the curl stuff, it's language independent, which is nice because you're not then seeing how to use the library they've published. You're seeing what's actually going on under the bonnet, which is really handy. Yep.
The two that I've used this week are console, so ES6 docs.
Right.
Write the ES6 code, it gives you the ES5 code.
Okay.
And the other one would be JQ lib for bash,
Right, JQ for bash.
which good docs, examples
Right.
with like the curl request, and it's got a console where you can
Okay.
evaluate like eval.
Okay. So you're talking there about tutorial stuff, some reference stuff, and a playground as well. There's like a sandbox that you can play in. Right. I haven't known anything about sandboxes. That's something I've missed. Okay. So that's interesting. Right. What about everybody else? No?
I'm sure I've used documentation, but I can't actually remember.
Okay. that's fine. Not all documentation has to make an impact. At the end of the day, it's there to help you get things done, isn't it? It doesn't all have to be a work of art. So, right. And I think we've really already covered this one about who writes documentation and who doesn't. So you said you don't, right? Why not? From your point of view, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot.
I suppose I don't really think about it. I suppose I know what's going on.
You know what's going on.
I don't. I won't sit there and think about it.
Okay, I have a slide for you. In fact, I have a slide with your name on it later on. Oh dear. How about everybody else? People we haven't heard from yet.
So one reason why I've not documented in the past is time.
Time. Okay. Right, I've got a slide on that. Okay.
What are you thinking about when you say documentation? I mean, do you not dot block your comments?
Excuse me.
Again, depends on time and the, I suppose the lifetime of the code that you're writing as well.
Right, so I've got something on dot blocks as well, because the PHP community is going backwards there in a big style. And I've got something on that. So I want to tackle some of the reasons I've heard over the last quarter of a century, now I really do feel old, about why people don't write documentation. Now, one thing I was expecting to hear, and I haven't, is the fact that you've already got access to most of the code you're working on, that it's already open source. I was expecting to hear that, because that's the one that I've heard the most. I've lost track of the number of times people have said, just go and read the source code. Completely lost track of that. How many times people have said that? Rob, you're pulling a face.
I am.
Why?
Most of us don't write open source. So when your question is, why are you not documenting?
Okay.
That's not because I don't write it open source.
Right,
The
so,
reason I don't look for documentation a lot of the time
Right.
is that I will go and read the source code.
so you're not writing open source, but if on you're thinking of your PHP code, forgetting your Swift stuff for the moment, thinking of your PHP code, surely you're pulling in via Composer a metric ton of open source libraries.
So I write documentation for my code, because,
You write documentation for your own code, yeah.
but I don't look for documentation for the open source code. I will go and read the source code.
You will go and read the source,
But
yes.
that's not why I don't document.
Right. But this is a reason I had a lot of people say is because they don't need to, because you've already got the source. And I've heard this as well for code written inside organizations. I've worked in some large teams. I think the largest group of people I was working with was 50, 60 people on a single project. And this was the one that came up time and time again. It's internal code, you've got access to it, what more do you need? The fact that none of them understood it was a bit of a challenge. So, but here's why it was a challenge. So the first question here is, hands up, who actually writes comments in their code? All right? Right, and what kind of comments do you write? Who writes proper doc blocks?
Yeah.
Right, so not everybody at that point.
Depends your definition of proper. I write doc blocks.
If I was to publish those doc blocks on a web page and not publish the source code alongside them, would I understand what the method did?
Yes.
Right, that's a proper doc block then. Okay. How many of you write inline comments? Okay, that's good. A lot more than I expected. And when you go in and have to change some code because you're fixing a bug, how many of you leave a comment in there to explain what you've done and why?
Refer to the ticket, if that counts.
Referring to the ticket.
Longer than the bug trackers.
Well, Jira, yeah, but it depends which bug tracker they use. There are some bug trackers like Jira that tend to outlive developers.
Yeah, we're just going through a transition from Jira. So
Right.
Management changed the bug tracker.
Management changed the bug tracker.
Yeah, I comment why.
Yeah.
It's an esoteric fix that doesn't belong.
Yeah. So in my experience, dot blocks are dying out. Those who are leading the charge to PHP 7 strict typing everywhere are not writing dot blocks enough as a result. And because a lot of people are using IDEs like PHP Storm, instead of writing dot blocks, they just say, oh, inherit the dot block from the parent that we're overriding, which is no good when you open the code up and you're not using an IDE like PHP Storm. So you end up with very, very thin dot blocks that actually don't tell you anything anymore. And that's becoming more and more prevalent. In my experience, inline comments are rare. It's very rare to see people writing them. The fact that so many of you are is, for me, fantastic. But in preparing this talk, I went and looked at a set of packages. I'm not naming any names here because I'm videoing it, but they are packages that the PHP community shout from the rooftops as these are good practice packages you should use, and they had 0 inline comments that I could find in any of their code. It's a very rare, and I can't remember the last time I worked with developers who wrote inline comments without being prompted. I really can't.
Would you say there's a relationship between the length of the number of lines in a given method and the chances of inline comment?
So I'm repeating the question for the sake of the camera. You're asking about relationship between length of method and whether people write inline comments. No. There is something on length of method later on in the talk. But my experience is it depends how you were taught to design software. So I was taught to write the comments before you wrote the code. There's another talk I've got online about doing code reviews. And the first 3-step process, and the first step is you validate your design before you write code. You may have to explore your design in code to figure out the right shape of it, but you validate your design first. It's the first part of your code review. And as part of that, we would write pseudocode out explaining what everything did. And then as a second phase, we would then write the code in to make that pseudocode work. That's how we were taught many, many years ago. And I find people with that background are much more likely to write inline comments, myself. As for comments explaining bug fixes, that's the polite version. It's incredibly rare. I've worked on projects which were nothing but maintenance projects, where everything was fixing something, fixing code that had already shipped, and they still didn't write these things at all. So you'd get code coming through for code review, and the length of time it would take to figure out whether you could let the code through or not was multiplied enormously, because you had to go back to the developer and interview them about their thought process before you could say whether the code was good to go out the door or not, because you had no idea why they'd made all these changes. So these comments really help. But my thesis, and my thing to you, is today, source code is effectively undocumented. You open up most code, and there's so little, other than the code itself, in there to tell you what it's doing, why it's doing. And the reason for that is this old chestnut. How many of you do Agile? Okay. So I've worked with firms and people who are, I was going to use the word fanatical, but that's not fair. But they certainly drink the Agile Kool-Aid. And here's something you see people say time and time again. That Agile way is that code is the documentation. You won't find that in the Agile manifesto if you go and look at the principles. And I couldn't track down where this came from. I spent a week trying to find this. I do not know where this came from. Like most agile with a capital A practices, I can't find an origin for them. And this is one of them. It's just something that's sprung up spontaneously. I guess it's like the Million Monkeys typing thing, if you're familiar with that. This is one of the things that's come out of that. People saying code's the documentation. Now, Rob was on about earlier about length of lines of code in a method. And code can be readable. I believe Laravel community make a big deal about the length of their methods. Big deal might be an understatement.
It came up recently, didn't it?
Taylor did, yeah.
Taylor did a post about how
He's been doing a lot of comparison posts, and I'm pretty sure that was one of them. Yeah,
methods are.
yeah. And there's a whole movement around this, which is clean code. Have any of you heard of clean code? Uncle Bob? So clean code helps a lot with making your code readable. It also makes your code faster under a lot of circumstances, by the way. Now we've got with PHP 7. PHP 5, not so much. PHP 7, you see a huge difference with shorter methods. Because PHP 7 makes much better use of CPU caches, whereas PHP 5 just stomped all over them. It's one of the reasons PHP 5 was slow. Where with PHP 7, the things are a lot better aligned in memory. And so smaller stuff fits in the cache, stays in the cache, and runs a lot faster as a result. It's where a lot of the speed benefits come from. Clean code is very good for that. Now, PSR2. How many of you use PSR2? You poor sods. So PSR2 doesn't really help much with readability. But that's one for the pub, I think. But I don't know how many of you are Arthur C. Clarke fans. Now I'm showing my age again, aren't I? Yeah, we are, okay. But he has a very famous quote that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And code's a form of technology, so I've mangled his quote a bit. I've worked on projects with people who you will go and see at PHP conferences, who stand up on stage. I've worked at national and international level projects. And even at that level, most of the developers on those projects don't know what the code does. They can't take it apart and understand it. And once you throw in things like event-driven programming, aspect-oriented programming, if any of you got familiar with that, you try and take a static system and understand how it works just by reading the code, it's almost impossible. Zen Framework is an absolute pain in the arse for that. ZF2, yep, I'm afraid so. It's got a lot going for it, but
Event-driven architecture is a nightmare.
Event-driven architecture is an archaeological nightmare. But even if you're not doing that, tracing through code, especially if it's undocumented, most people can't do it. They really can't. They'll come back with an answer, but they can't tell you why it works. They can only go so many levels down, and then it all starts to break down. So code can tell you what, but it can't tell you why. This is another problem with undocumented code, why code isn't documentation. It can't tell you what the requirement was. What business need are you meeting with that code? Those of you who work in teams where there's a business owner, a product owner who comes along and says, we need to do X for, for this release or that conference or whatever. How many, if I took a line of code out of your apps, how would I find out what the business requirement was? How would you trace it back today? Yeah. Forget your Git history. Just looking at your code. Imagine I took a copy of your code without your Git history, because I'm assuming your Git commits may have those ticket numbers in. But again, even that's quite a hit and miss practice. If I just took your source code, yeah, how could I trace that back to the requirement? How would I do that? Why is the requirement the way it is? Undocumented requirements. So yes, we're getting away from code here, but this is why code isn't effective as documentation. I've done some work in industries that are regulated. I've done some government work where requirements are not something people can just go, oh, I think it should be X, I think it should be Y. There are constraints, legal, financial, that they have to work within. And developers who turn those requirements into reality need to know that. Or they can't build it in the first place, you can't test it, and you can't make sure it doesn't break in future. So you need to know those things. And it can't tell you why the software is designed like that. So earlier I went on about the bug fixes, about how important it was to document bug fixes, because why are you changing the code? That's one aspect of software design. Any sort of architecture, why is software designed the way it is? But the other thing is, where's the tutorials if you're just reading the code to tell you how to use the code, how it's meant to be used? Where are you going to get that information? Where is the next person going to get that information from? And that's the theme we're going to come back to in a moment. I promised you I've got a slide for you, so what I'm trying to encourage people here is, you've got to write this stuff down. And it's got to be discoverable as well, which is the comments on bug trackers. Bug trackers are better than nothing, as long as there's traceability to find them. But if it's not being written down, where is it? What you're left with? You're left with it in people's heads. You're left with it with people's inboxes. People's inboxes are an unaccessible resource, so they're no good. But if we come to people's heads, that's the next reason I hear frequently from people, is I'll be able to remember that. There's a lot of knowing smiles and nods. I've been guilty of that more than once, freely admit, in small projects and large. I got my fingers burned. Anyone else had any similar experiences? Yeah. I think the only thing we need to say about this is leave it for 2 months, fill your head with something else, and then come back to it. See how much you remember. Some of us have fantastic memories, and some people, the lucky sods, are born with eidetic memories, which I am very jealous about. I'm not. I'm old, I'm grey. I can't remember what I had for lunch. I shouldn't say that on camera, should I? I mean, anyway. But give it 2 months, give it 8 weeks, come back to it, and then see how much you can remember. Even if you can start to remember the what, how much of the why can you remember? Yeah? But the other one I hear with, especially with solo projects, this is what I've got with you in mind, my friend, is that people think they'll always be around to look after the code they've written. They don't think they're going anywhere. They think the code, they'll be around as long as the code's in use. But it's often not phrased like that. It's often phrased as, I'm the only person who works on this code. That's what you'll often hear people say. How many of you have heard people say that? There's a lot of nodding heads. How many of you have said that to people? There's a few nodding heads. Yep. Now, if you're a one-man company doing your own product it's a service you host and you run and you're a one-man company, then maybe that's true. How many of you are in that situation? You're a very lucky person, Rob, in more ways than one.
Some maintain code.
Some maintain code.
Depends if you think that's lucky or not. I said that.
I don't think I'm maintaining code lucky, but that's me. But yeah. But how many of you write all the code how many of you own a component outright in your organization, your teams, who isn't called Rob? 2 of you do. All right. Do you own, and what level do you own? Component, the app, the whole project?
So in a previous place, I owned 2 or 3 components.
2 or 3 components? Okay.
So, yeah.
Right. So you open source them.
Open sourced it.
Right. Did you ever get anyone try to contribute?
No, I didn't.
No contributions. Okay.
Need to at the time.
Didn't need to. No one needed to contribute.
One pull request.
Okay. And how about yourself?
So I've got a couple of projects where I write and present the code.
Okay, a couple of projects. And did you write them from scratch?
Yes.
Right. And will you be the only person who ever touches them?
One of them, yes.
Okay.
But the rest, and well,
Right.
no.
Right. So the rest of them, no.
I'm leaving, so.
You're leaving. I have a slide for that in a moment. Right. But before we get on to people moving, I want to focus back on the code for a moment. How many of you know what the half-life of your code is? How long your code likely to hang around? What's your reasonable guess then?
15 years.
15 years for you. Right. How about anybody else?
Stuff we're working on next, probably. I think the next lot of code we're doing PHP is probably 2-3 years.
2-3 years. Well,
Possibly.
the code will be used in production for 2 to 3 years before it's replaced.
Yeah.
Or it's going to take you 2-3 years to produce it. I'm trying to clarify. I'm not putting you on the spot. I'm trying to clarify.
This is gonna go.
Excuse me.
Let me think. So we're splitting out monolithic into micro apps.
Okay. And so in 2-3 years' time, you'll be reversing that then.
Hopefully.
I'm not kidding.
No, in 2-3 years, we'll be moving into Node, I think.
Node, yeah, Node's going to win.
I suppose, I don't know, altogether, building and maintaining it, maybe 4 to 6 years.
4 to 6 years. Okay, 4 to 6 years. Anyone else, especially from the second row who are a little quiet, how long do you reckon your code's likely to last?
Couldn't even hazard a guess.
Couldn't even hazard a guess. Well, I appreciate the honesty. So, most code outlives the participation of its original author. Now, my examples are quite extreme. I have maintained code that was originally written back in 1973. I have written code that, those of you who have Linux on your machines, it's on your machines right now, I'm willing to bet, that I wrote in 1994. So that's 23 years ago at some point this year. Those are more extreme examples, but the code I'm using this week is 5 to 6 years old, easily. And I use some code that's 7 to 8 years old. Yes, it was written for PHP 4, but it still works. You use something like WordPress, goodness knows how old some of the code in there is. I remember when WordPress came around in 2006, so it could, some of the code in there could easily be 10 years old, for example. It was a fork of B2 Evolution. Yep. Yeah. I still remember kicking WordPress out of Gen 2 back in the day for their security problems. How life repeats. But so code can last a very long time is a message I'm trying to get across here. And it can last a lot longer than people expect. Now let's go back to people. So how long have you been doing what you're doing, where you're doing it?
7 months for me.
7 months. How long for yourself? Because you said you're leaving.
18, well, about 18 months.
18 months and you're moving on. Right. Okay. According to employment data, developers last less than 4 years before they move on. It's quite rare to come across developers who've done 4 years or more in a single firm, according to employment data. And it's getting worse, depending on your point of view. The tenure time the time people spend with an employer is going down year on year, not up. So people are moving on more and more frequently and leaving more and more code behind as a result. If you do what Rob and I do, well, you wouldn't call yourself a freelancer, would you? No, just about, begrudgingly. So people like me are brought into larger projects. Sometimes we deliver the whole project, but normally we're there just to deliver part of the project. We're brought in for our specialist skills, and then we move on. I spent, God, how long was that? 18 months in total? Spent 18 months on a government project, and when I arrived, it'd been going for the best part of 2 years beforehand. By the time it went live, a lot of those people were gone because their work was done, and most of the rest of them left shortly afterwards, after it was live. So freelancers are shipping code that often they never even see go into production on larger projects. So, and also the other thing we were talking before we started the talk about enterprises and serious jobs and all that. How many of you have worked in enterprises? And large organizations. So I think you know where I'm going with this one, but how many of you actually do the maintenance of the code you write? I maintain my code, but not many hands. Yeah. Certainly in enterprises and larger projects, there's a maintenance team, there's a support team who has to clean up the mess. Their job is to fix bugs. And when I started, that was the model, because I started before the web was commercialized. So the web existed, but I joined the pre-web. It wasn't an industry. And back then, you came in as a support developer maintaining code, because new systems were rarely written. 90% of the work was maintaining and extending existing systems before the web came along. But even today, other people maintain the code people write. So going back and looking over the arguments that I've put forward, do people, who thinks that source code's all you need? Does anyone think that? If I fail to convince anyone that's a bad idea? Is anyone willing to admit it? Okay, about code as the documentation. Hopefully that one's buried for good. Really hope that. It can't possibly be the documentation on any commercial system. Remembering everything you did and why you did it. Have I made any inroads in that one? From the faces, I'm hoping so, but I'm not certain. And the only one who will ever touch the code. Hopefully I've knocked that one on the head a bit as well. So I'm not saying that everything should be documented, though. It might sound like I am, but that's not what I'm saying. There are good reasons to pick and choose what you document. And we start with time. Documentation doesn't write itself. Anyone who's ever automatically generated docs from their code. Yeah, these tools exist. They've been around for a very long time. I mean, PHP doc was certainly around in 2004. So that's 13 years. Java doc goes back even further. But the documentation it produces, no one uses it. And it's not the tool's fault, it's not enough. Documentation takes time. When I'm planning a project, I tack on 30% of how long it takes to write the code for documentation. That's what I budget for, about 30%. It gets faster as people get more used to it, but 30% is a pretty good ballpark figure, my personal experience. And just to put that in context, if coding takes X, 40% of that time is testing. Another 20% is documentation, with at least 20%, sorry, with at least 40% left for actual coding, in my experience.
So if shorter time, you should skip the testing.
Rob, skip the testing.
Skip the docs.
People do skip the docs all the time because of lack of time. It gets better with practice. But if you've never written documentation before, this is where people of my generation want to rant on about younger people and their inability to do spelling and grammar and all the rest of it, admittedly. But when I was at school, a very long time ago, and we wrote on slates, tablets, admittedly, a chalkboard and all the rest of it, we did a lot of long-form writing. I think my English exam was a long-form essay. So what would that have been? That would have been at least 1,000 words, for example. So at a very young age, we did all that. Now, put that in context, the main piece of documentation I maintain is for a tool called Story Player, and that's something like 70,000 words, and people still complain they don't know what the hell to do with it. So documentation can become quite large. But there's my slide lamenting people's that. But it's something people have to practice. And you've got to accept at first that it's going to be a bit ropey. You can look at it and go, oh my God, I don't want anyone else to see that. But you're only going to get better at it by doing it. You have to start somewhere and just keep going at it. Now, another reason to be careful about deciding when and what to document is, are you documenting something too soon? If you do a lot of R&D, if you work in startups where you're trying things out all the time, you don't know what's going to stick, you don't even know what's going to ship, there's no point writing documentation if you think you're going to throw away 50, 60% of the things that are coming up. If you're in a prototyping environment, rapid iteration, sometimes the right thing to do is to wait until you're happy with it before you document it. It's easier to write long-form documentation once something's stabilized. Because one of the worst things is trying to radically change an existing document. That is one of the worst things for documentation and for maintaining docs, which is why a lot of docs don't get maintained and get abandoned. I've noticed Rob's nodding a lot there.
My ZF1 tutorial went through that.
Your ZF1 tutorial.
I wrote the same code one tutorial when 0.2 came out.
Ouch.
And maintained it all the way through to 1.12. And there were 4 major reruns through that.
Wow. Yeah. So not just me, it's Rob as well. But the other thing as well, some code is disposable. If you work in a digital agency making microsites for campaigns, you could argue a lot of that code is by its nature disposable because it's got a fixed shelf life for the length of that campaign, and then a lot of it gets thrown away. What's the point of documenting that if you know you're binning it? Yeah. There's absolutely no value in that because it's for a fixed campaign. So some things are temporary, and if they're temporary, don't bother with it. But how many times, I've heard this so many times over the years, people going, oh, we don't need to document that, it's temporary, it's a prototype, it's never going to ship. Yeah, every new thing I've ever built that has gone into production was a prototype that was never supposed to ship. I have never in 25 years worked on something that had a prototype phase that didn't go live. Not once, personally. And Rob's saying he's not either. So it's something to keep in mind, is getting that balance right is a bit of a black art. But also, don't document trivial things. Channeling my inner PHP Yorkshire there. Don't document stuff that's bleeding obvious. There's no point. And don't document things no one will ever care about. You don't need to document 100% of your code all the way through in long form on your website as HTML docs. You don't need to. And we'll come on to that more in a moment. But I'm probably not the only person who's going around with all these things about challenging people's excuses, reasons, justifications for not documenting, and trying to explain when it's good to doc and when it's not to doc. But there's something else. If you document all the time, there's something else, and another reason, and this is the main reason why I write documentation. Because I want to understand what I've built. Okay? When I'm writing documentation, I have to stop writing code. I have to take a step back, and I have to look at what I've built and explain it. As a result, I have to think about how someone's going to use what I've created, whether it's an API or if it's a component. And that's starting to become a form of testing. It's a thought exercise. So it's not formal testing like unit tests or acceptance tests or anything like that, but it's a thought exercise, and you're starting to think about how someone else would use what you've built. And every time I do that, first of all, you have to take that step back to look at what they're doing. And you've got to learn to see what it's showing you. And when you do that, you can take advantage of it, and you can start to correct your design problems before they become APIs that never ever change. Or you start changing your API so rapidly in Composer no one can use your dependencies, which is another problem we have in the PHP community. It's another reason I like Node, of course, because it can load multiple versions of the same library. It doesn't care. This is the way prototyping works in JavaScript. In PHP, we don't have that luxury. We've got to ship APIs that are at least going to stick around a bit longer, because you're stuck with one version of your API in someone's app. They can't load two different versions of the same API in the same namespace in. But so that's something I do a lot. Before I ship code, I will document it, and then I'll go in and change things. And my unit tests don't show me these problems, because unit tests are me validating what I intended to do in the first place. They don't prove that someone else can use my work. All they do is prove that my code does what I hoped it was going to do when I wrote it. Documentation helps me understand how someone else is going to use it. And I've had so much value from that over the years. More and more in the last few years, when I'm doing lots of smaller projects, shipping code that I'm never going to touch again because I've left that particular project and moved on. They're no longer my customer. And so I've had a lot of success with people going, oh, you've done an amazing job, because they think they've got version 1, that's what I've tagged, but in reality it's version 10, because through testing and then through documentation, I've understood that, oh my God, what have I really done here? And I've been able to rapidly iterate and sort it out. So they see something that's way more polished and more fit for purpose than where I started from. That helps as well. If I can't explain it, I clearly don't know what my own code's doing. And that does happen. My company, my job title is Chief Software Archaeologist. And I have been employed as a software archaeologist on projects to take other people's code apart and explain it. So I'm very good at that. But I can still write code. I'm going, what was I on when I came up with that? It happens to all of us. And all experience does is help, hopefully, strip away the idea that you can ship it. Hopefully. It doesn't stop you writing this stuff. But the other thing as well is because I've mentioned a lot of the word why throughout this talk so far. If I can't tell someone else why I've done it the way I've done it and make it sound reasonable and convincing on the page, often that means what I've built is a conceit. It's not something that's a good idea. And this is important as well when you're shipping things for other people to use. Your design decisions are forcing them to work a certain way. I'm going to choose Zen Framework as an example. If you compare Zen Framework, how many of you use Twig? Okay, so a few experiences with that. Or any other templating language in PHP. Okay, so instead of writing everything out in pure PHP, it's a domain-specific language that allows you to write HTML pages very quickly and inject data from your app into the page that goes out. One of the strengths of Twig is that it will escape all your data for you before it goes out the door. I am aware that there are arguments from different people about the quality of that escaping. I'm not going to get into that, but it does it. You take something like Zen Framework's Vue support, and it has helpers to help you augment the HTML you're sending out, but you have to escape everything yourself manually in your HTML. You have to get it 100% right, or you're shipping a security bug. And someone somewhere made that decision. But where is it? Where is it written down? How do I find out who did that? How do I challenge that? How do I get, when I'm calling to a customer who's complaining about, well, why did we waste money on Zen Framework? Why didn't we just go with Symfony in the first place, for argument's sake? How do I explain to them, well, there are benefits to this approach? I can't because that justification doesn't exist that I can find. So putting these things in docs doesn't just help you, it helps the people whose workflows, whose approaches are fundamentally changed by the design decisions you've made. So you should write these justifications down, hold them up in a mirror and go, am I willing to put my name to that? Very important. I'll get off my soapbox for a moment. Let's move on to what to document. Right. What do you think should be documented? A very, very generic high level. What would you like to see documented? If time and money was infinite and you could spend as long as you wanted writing documentation and your boss didn't shout at you, what would you like to see documented?
Examples.
Examples, okay. So that's tutorial type stuff. Requirements, okay.
I really like to see the why, and I also like to see what has been tried and
Okay.
not through.
That's an interesting one, that.
That's one that really
Right.
I find really helpful when I go back to my old code and I've written down what I've tried before.
Right, so you want to see why, and you almost want like a log, a history of the development.
Yeah, particularly for an algorithm.
Yeah.
Why did we end up on this one?
Why did you end up on that one? Or why did you pick that algorithm? Right. Okay. Anybody else? Does anyone care about documentation? It's a legitimate question.
Yeah.
Okay. It's okay not to care. There's no right or wrong in this. This is all a point of view. It's all a philosophical argument at the end of the day. If you've got an approach that works, where documentation hinders rather than helps, stick with your approach. Because if it works, it's not dumb. But with documentation, you've got to think of two key things. What needs documenting, which is what we've discussed, but also who you're writing it for. Very important part with writing documentation. How many times have you come across a piece of documentation that makes no sense to you because you don't understand the thing that's been documented in the first place? It's documentation written for people who already know the thing that's been written about, and therefore the documentation is useless, superfluous, ineffective. Pick your descriptive term there. So you've got to think about those two things. Now, what documentation do you use? I think we've covered that pretty well earlier. So I'm going to throw some ideas here about what I think should be documented. I think the first thing you've got to document is the point of use. So not documenting for yourself, well, it might be yourself, but documenting certainly for other people. What would the point of use be for your code? Yeah. Anybody? How do other people interact with your code? Which parts? Sorry. Start using it. So which parts did they touch?
All the public methods.
All the public methods. Okay. Yeah. Anybody else? Right. So point of use these days. Any service-related APIs, so HTTP, if you're building REST APIs or CQRS, that type of stuff. If you're shipping packages, components via Composer, who here doesn't use Composer? Everyone uses Composer? Awesome. Good. I'm glad that battle's won. Yes. But your package, your component, your library, call it what you will. Document that. Document its public methods. You don't have to document all the ones, just document the ones you want people to use. It's because PHP doesn't have module support at all. I mean, God, even C++ has better support, and that's saying something because it's terrible. Just document the things that people are meant to use, because they're the interfaces that you're going to maintain. The ones that are internal, don't bother with those, and we'll come on to that a bit more in a moment. And document your source code. Comments everywhere, as we've talked earlier, because people will have to dig in to understand. When you're using something and it stops working, or you can't get it to do what you want, you've got to dive into the internals at that point. So make sure your code's commented. So when do you look at documentation? When is it you reach for documentation? And we can include Stack Overflow in this. Stack Overflow is effectively documentation these days. So when do you go? What prompts you to go and look at documentation?
If there's a problem that you think you've got an idea of, but you want to confirm and the rest
Okay.
of the team busy.
Right. Okay. So you're looking at how to use something. Right. Anybody else?
An error crops up or an exception.
Error and exception. Okay. Anybody else?
Flow exception.
Best practices.
Doing that a lot this week.
Right. But that's your Swift ecosystem, isn't it?
No, this will be PHP.
PHP.
I'm prepping for PHP Yorkshire talk.
Right. Okay. But other than PHP the right way, there isn't much about that, is there?
No, it's basically been APIs and API usage that I've been interested in.
Right.
Still documentation.
Okay. I'm going to catch you in the pub afterwards if you have time, I think. So the first thing I want to urge everyone to do is write documentation for people who are using your code for the first time, new users. Because they need to know how to get started. They need to know how to use it, how it's meant to be used, and best practices, as Rob said. Because if people use things the way you intended it, you'll get a lot less bug reports for a start, because they're not trying to force a square peg into a round hole. Now, it might be they don't use your library at all because they go, it's not really what I wanted, but that's also a positive choice, not a negative one. The documentation helps them save everybody a lot of time, a lot of aggro. Reference documentation's the obvious one. What does this method do? What's its parameters? What do they mean? So just saying something's a string is pretty useless because most things aren't just strings. The content of the string matters, for example. What does it return? Does it not return anything? Things like that. So classes, they're public methods. API endpoints. I mentioned the Stripe documentation earlier. You don't just want to document the library, you want to document the protocol on the wire, the JSON that goes backwards and forwards, or the XML if you're unlucky enough to still work in those days. These are things people will go and reach for and look for. And by documenting them, all the things I've said earlier about being able to see what you've built, these are the things you're looking at. Because if you document a set of classes, public methods, and write a tutorial about how it's all meant to be used, and you're halfway through the tutorial and you're going, I don't know how to do this, or you realize you can't do it, you know to go back and look at your code and change things. So it all really helps. It all hangs together. So I've kind of trailed this one, but internals, the things that are for you to change, that people aren't meant to touch. What do you think about documenting these? How much effort should you put into them? Anybody?
I suppose it goes for the same thing. If you, I suppose it's bus insurance and stuff like that.
Right.
You leave or you get hit by a bus, is someone else going to be able to pick up your work.
Okay, so you need to document enough for other people to pick up your work once it's gone. Yep, that's a good one. Anybody else? Does anyone disagree with that statement? You're not looking convinced either way, to be honest. You're all sitting on the fence on this one. So, the thing for me, this is the question I always ask when I'm figuring out how much of the internals to document. Is my API so robust enough that I can change what happens behind it and the people who use my package don't notice? If I change the internal code and it affects people who use the API, then I've got to document that behavior, because that behavior is part of the API whether I like it or not. This is always something people should aim for. Make sure your interfaces hide your internal workings. It makes maintenance a ton easier, but often it can also lead to very slow code. So it's a balancing act with that. But if you can't hide into anything you can't hide internally, someone needs to know about it because it is going to bite them. My favorite example is doctrine. When you have an error in doctrine, it goes and shuts down your connection to your database. Well, technically, it closes the manager that's being used to manage all the units of work. And if you've got a queue of work up there that hasn't yet gone through to your database, all of a sudden you've got a lot of database work that can't apply. That is a behavior that I wish was better documented. One of many with doctrine. Doctrine doesn't document its internals well enough, and they do bite you in the arse. But that's something I wish had been documented, because it affects their way of handling an error. They don't just tell you, oh, the SQL's failed, we'll carry on with the rest of your SQL. They go, we don't know that the rest of your SQL in your queue is actually safe to execute, so we're just going to call a halt to everything. And if you've got a commercial system handling £100 million a year in payments, and it's crashing because this is happening, that's not a nice thing to explain to the person who's looking forward to their £100 million. Done that one. Yeah. I'm not saying doctrine's behavior is right or wrong. What I'm saying is, if developers don't know about these behaviors, it becomes a surprise. And there's no such thing as a nice surprise. All surprises are nasty. One of my rules whenever I'm running a project is rule of no surprises. Nothing derails a project like surprises, especially the good ones. Oh, I've just done this for you. You've done what? No. So, yeah. Do you think I've missed anything about what to document that I haven't mentioned so far? I mean, this is all fairly high-level stuff, very deliberately. Are you all fairly happy so far? Right. Let's look at some tools. How many of you have heard of Slate? Okay. You've never used it. I'm about to use it this month. I'm very confident it's going to be good, apart from the fact that it doesn't work with Ruby 2.4. Or more accurately, one of the many gems in gem hell that it relies on doesn't work with Ruby 2.4 at the minute, which they are blaming on a change in Ruby's behavior in Ruby 2.4, and I just wish someone had shipped some code that worked. Doesn't matter who's to blame, ship some code that bloody works. Right. You mentioned Stripe. I don't know if you can see that very well, but it looks. Yep. I can't remember if Slate is used for Stripe's documentation or if Slate is written by someone who looked at Stripe's documentation and went, "That is awesome. That's the way to do it." Can't remember which way round it is, but their website will tell you. So why Slate for APIs? I should have mentioned that. So Slate's strength is documenting APIs between servers, so HTTP services. That's its strength. It's superb at that. Static site, so the docs can live in Git. So as you maintain your code, you can maintain your documentation at the same time. I'm going to talk a bit more about that towards the end of this talk. It can mix tutorials and reference documentation all in one, which is really, really handy. So you find a lot of people do. First half of the documentation is, here's how to use it. Second half is, here's all the API calls you can make. Here's the inputs, here's the outputs. And here's all the examples in all the languages we support. So if you make stuff, you do a Ruby library, a Python library, a PHP library, a Node library, you can do all that, and you can stick curl in there. It doesn't care. It's all Markdown. Now, I don't know if anyone uses WooCommerce, but I discovered that they use Slate because they're taking advantage of WordPress's REST API. A few chuckles. I wonder what's prompting that.
You didn't put the quotes out rest.
I am not opening a can of worms around WordPress any more than I already have tonight. But they've done it. That's a PHP. I mean, you don't get more of a PHP project than something like WooCommerce, anything for WordPress. And they've used it, and the documentation is fantastic. And underneath, it's all Markdown, which means anyone can write it. You don't need much training to use Markdown. If you can't use Markdown after half an hour, find something else for them to do. But one of the things I've done, one of the reasons I've picked this particular screenshot is the code examples. I love how Slate does the code examples. So if you've ever written any Markdown for GitHub pages or READMEs on GitHub, you just put these fences around the code and saying which type of code it is. So they've got shell, which yeah, I'm not going to. They've got JavaScript. They've got other examples following that. You just put them one after the other, and Slate takes care of the rest. You don't have to put them in separate files and try and collate them and keep them all together. It's all nice and contained. So I haven't used this in Angular yet, but I have I'm building a product for a startup at the minute, and I'm reaching the point where the API needs documenting, so I can hand it over to them. And Slate's what I'm going to be using. I love documentation built in this style. I used it on a payment system I was working on last year. Documentation other people had written, and it was so nice to use. So Slate would be my #1 recommendation. Does anyone else document their service APIs at all? Does anyone write products that have APIs? And what do you use?
I use a service called API Uri.
Okay. All right.
I've used that for a couple of products.
Okay.
And that doesn't, you can't really write the code, it's just the request and response that you see.
Right. Okay.
But it gives you quite a nice side-by-side view.
So this is one of the 2 initiatives to actually start. They've got all sorts of schemas and things where you can actually document your APIs, haven't they? I did look at this last year.
Went for Swagger.
Swagger, that's yes.
API specification is now.
Yeah.
It's also Ubuntu, the playgrounds, essentially, built in
Right.
auto thing.
Okay.
But because we also had to do tutorials,
Yeah.
which Swagger doesn't do, we ended up using Jekyll.
Yeah. I haven't got a slide for Jekyll, but I do need to mention Jekyll. Thank you for it.
It's like, we've got half of it like that,
Yeah.
half of it is Swagger.
Yeah.
I have to push the
Yeah.
Slate doesn't.
So we tried documenting an API with Swagger last year.
Have my sympathy.
We found the tool chain did not live up to the advertisement. We also didn't like the presentation of the final work, but we found the tool chain not very robust at all. And we also found the cost of writing those documentation. We couldn't sell that to management. This is straightforward. This kind of free-form documentation is so much easier than documentation that says you've got to put this there, you've got to do this there. You've got to use this tool, you've got to use that tool. This stuff's so much quicker to write in because you just chuck it in a text file and you're done.
The thing I liked about the Swagger spec
Right.
is that you don't forget anything
You don't forget anything in the Swagger spec.
in terms of the documenting your endpoints and all the headers, all the query parameters,
Right.
the JSON payloads, what the types of each element is, whether it's required or not, each summary, the detailed information, because there's a
Right.
placeholder for all of those.
But you don't have to use those placeholders. So the placeholders you're talking about, you don't have to use, because we ran into that problem. When I had developers doing this stuff, the APIs were half documented because people were just giving up. So I'd rather have something.
We're not on that.
I'd rather have something that was easy, least path of resistance to get people to do things. If
You have to like YAML as well, which is my major stuff.
I've done Ansible, so YAML's all right. I never said Ansible was all right. I don't use Ansible anymore.
Not a fan of YAML.
Okay, but this isn't to talk about YAML. But Rob did mention Jekyll. I'm going to come on to Jekyll in a moment. But the other tool I use, and this is one I was using today, and I've been using for quite a while now, is Couscous. Anyone heard of Couscous? Nope.
Not the website.
Not the website. Right, so I use Couscous for documenting my composer packages, my libraries. I used to use Jekyll for that. All the story player documentation is written in Jekyll. I've been burned badly by Jekyll. Two problems so Jekyll is another static site generator written in Ruby. If memory serves, it was written by one of the co-founders of GitHub. Memory serves. And I've had problems with them breaking backwards compatibility. I've had problems with performance with it on larger document sets. And as you try to build more structured documentation, I found building that structure with Jekyll was very hard. Jekyll was great for building content where the content area is all that matters on the page. But my documentation has a lot of navigation elements. And I found Jekyll was terrible for that. And the plugin ecosystem didn't have an answer for me. And my Ruby's gone. I haven't used Ruby written any in Anger since 2008. So it's a very long time ago now. Christ, yeah. But I use Couscous for my libraries. It's another static site generator. It's PHP one, which helps because you can get in there and you can change things. Again, you can mix tutorials and reference docs. And it's really easy to incorporate into your CI. So if you use Jenkins or any other system like that, it's really easy to have it so that as you tag stuff, your docs go out the door as well. Really handy with that. I'm very, very happy with it. Now, I actually maintain my own fork of Couscous for the moment. I'm going to talk to the original author and see if they want my changes back. But I've been adding a lot more metadata to pages. So here's a screenshot from one of my things. And I've got some extra elements on the page that I do. So I've got navigation down the left-hand side. I've got these previous next pages. And that's all auto-generated. With Jekyll, you'd have to put this at the top of every page as page matter they called it? Yeah, it's the YAML section at the top between 3 dashes. You'd have to put all this in with Jekyll, and then you'd have to write a template to work through it all. And if you were trying to pull in other pages, metadata, you'd have to write recursive stuff, and it got really messy. But with Couscous, I just I wrote my own PHP class to just pull it all out of the main Couscous index file and stick it into each page. Really easy. And that's the stuff that's in my fork of Couscous at the minute, because I want my documentation to be easy to navigate. But it's really good. Couscous. It's PHP, runs on your machine. It is a little battery heavy. When it notices anything's changed, it nukes the website that you're running locally and rebuilds every single page. So as your website grows, you eat battery more, and if you live on the road and battery life's important, that's an issue. Just be aware of that. But if you're tethered to a desk all the time, you're not going to notice. You're pulling a face. Oh, okay. There's one above your head. Okay. Are there any other tools you guys use that I've not mentioned at all, and Rob hasn't mentioned with Jekyll and Apiary?
Previously used DocuWiki.
DocuWiki. Okay.
Nice, but it's horrible to
It's nice, but it's horrible.
Yeah, it's nice to use when it works, but it's horrible when it doesn't.
Sounds like Stockholm Syndrome to me.
Yeah. So it's written in PHP and the
Yep.
code is awful. I've had to at the last place, and we used it
Okay.
in form. So we had templates and stuff like that for documentation.
Right. So I don't use a wiki because I want the code to be in Git. And I know DocuWiki will write files, and you can now we've got the PHP dev server built into PHP. You can always point that at your docs folder. But a lot of people won't. What they'll go is edit the live docs, and at that point, your docs and your code's starting to separate. So for me, that kind of tool is something I don't personally advocate anymore.
We did install a versioning plugin for it.
Yeah.
There was a version. The plugin, the ecosystem is good.
Right.
for that. So we had plugins we had was versioning. It needed 2 people to approve the changes.
Right.
To go live.
Okay.
And it also did it in a Git kind of way where you put a summary of
Right.
what you were changing. It.
Okay. So it had a change log. It had an approval process.
So that was handy.
Now I'm okay. So I'm going to preempt my next set of slides and say, I think that's your pull request, your merge request process. Now we've got Git. And I think it's better, far, far better done that way than editing a live site, personally.
Depends on who's doing the writing.
I'm going to challenge that one and say I don't think it depends on who's doing the writing. I haven't yet met a technical author who can't be trained to use basic Git. The GUI tools are so good these days. They don't need to know how branching and all the rest works.
You need to have a corporate that's prepared to allow the internal people to access GitHub through the firewall.
Okay.
It's been our biggest problem internally among my clients.
Right.
It's the technical side related to getting through corporate politics.
Okay.
It's a nightmare.
Right. So but it doesn't have to be GitHub. If you're using Git, it doesn't matter where it's hosted.
There is that, but then they're all Windows.
They're all Windows.
Prepared to run Git server on a Windows box.
You don't need to run a Git server on a Windows box because, again, all the tools these days are so easy to download and use.
So what I mean is we can only have it internally.
You can have it internally, yeah?
We have Windows boxes.
Yeah.
And I'm not running a Git
Right.
Git server inside that box.
At that point, you've got bigger problems.
It's really pretty well.
Um,
In terms of your tools, though, going back to the actual question there,
Yeah.
The vast majority of my actual docs for most of my code base is a doc folder within the code base.
Right.
Like that files.
yeah. And that's where we're going.
It's wiki-like in the sense that we link as well.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Are there any other tools anyone uses that we haven't already covered? Anyone thinks that should have got a mention that I haven't?
The only other tool we use is Gitbook, which converts
Gitbook. Yep.
query docs essentially.
Yeah.
Just gives you a slide bar with all your meta in it.
Yep.
Just parses it out.
Yep. So I've seen Gitbook used a lot. Where did I come across that? I think it was the GraphQL documentation might have been. You've also got things like read the docs. I haven't used read the docs in anger. When I've seen people use read the docs, they always put the docs in a separate repo rather than in the same repo. So
Sphinx, but nobody uses it outside of Python.
Sphinx, yeah, well, that's read the docs, isn't it?
Oh, is that really?
Yeah, that's read the docs.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which Zen Framework was using for a long time, wasn't they?
They were using. Yeah, they went to RST, so that probably was Sphinx.
Yeah.
But if you go back even further, when I was doing it, it was all DocBook.
DocBook. Oh, DocBook. Yes.
The granddaddy of the format you could turn into
Yes, the thing whose name shall not be uttered. DocBook, yes. I was going to say something and I've forgotten. I have missed a trick here. I should have put up a slide showing you PHP units documentation, because what I'm about to say would have made a lot more sense. How many of you have been to the PHP unit website and used its manual? Okay. So Sebastian inspired me a lot. When I started trying to figure out tool chains many years ago, I actually had a talk with Sebastian to understand how he was doing it. Because one of the things he does on there is he's got documentation for different versions, all on the one website, which I thought was excellent. And how many times have you gone to a website and all they've got is the latest and greatest documented, but that's no good to you because your project isn't able to use the latest and greatest, isn't able to upgrade. Yeah? And this is where Sebastian, I think, did this fantastic thing with the PHP unit thing. So he documents, okay, it's the latest and greatest PHP Unit 4, PHP Unit 5, but at least you can upgrade reasonably within those different versions. That's not going to be as much of a sticker. And maintaining all that documentation side by side is something where I think a lot of other tools have failed. And one of the things I like about these freeform tools is you can put version 1, version 2, version 3 API all side by side because they're freeform. It's up to you to decide how to structure the documents. If you're generating your documentation from code, let's say you generated it using PHP doc because it's the thing I know best at, it's going to give you a snapshot of that code you've pointed at. It's not also going to generate version 1, version 2 at the same time if you're pointing in at version 3. All it can generate is a website for version 3. But for people on version 2, especially if you're still maintaining version 2, that's no good at all. So when to write docs, how to keep docs maintained. This is where we're going on to with this. I'm a great advocate, as you write the code, write the docs. Even with everything I've said before about making sure what you're documenting is the right time to document it, if you're shipping the code, that's the point you make sure your docs are written. What this gives you is your documentation and code is all part of the same pull request. It's all part of the same merge request. You don't write the code, merge it, write the docs, merge it. If you're going to document it at all, it's one merge request, it's one pull request, it's one thing to review. So you can go along and say, okay, well the docs say X, the code says Y. You can spot these problems in a code review because you've got that comparison at that moment in time. And it also gives you the advantage that when you tag the code, you're tagging the docs because they're in your code base. They're in a docs folder, and they shouldn't be served. If you're using a modern style application where there's a public folder that the server serves and that all goes through to a front-end controller of some kind, so your docs folder isn't automatically served out. You're still tagging it at the same time. So if you want to know, if it's an internal project, you want to go back, see how version 1.3 worked, you check out version 1.3, and there's its docs, right there, at that moment in time. No guesswork required. Really easy. And the other thing you can do with all this is you can chuck this via Jenkins or whatever, publish the documentation. Couscous has instructions on its website about how to do this via Travis. And if those instructions, because I noticed they've updated the website since I originally looked at it, if the instructions aren't on there, search for Snipey Head, I believe. What, Alison, is it? She goes as? Yeah.
She's awesome.
She is. Utterly awesome. She's the one who pointed me at Couscous. Well deserves a shout out. But she actually wrote the instructions about how to make Travis publish your docs when a build passes, so that your docs are automatically up to date. Because Agile, one of the cool things of Agile with a lowercase a is ship early, ship often. And the reason for that is because people get excited by new things. They don't, if they've had to wait 2 months for something and then it finally arrives, they're in a different mindset. But if they're constantly seeing new things, if they say something and half an hour later they can go, you've delivered it, people react much more positive to it, and the energy's there. It's injecting energy into the system. Same with your docs. Publish your docs at the same time. Make your document. Maybe this is not such a good slide, but if you write automated tests, make your documentation as normal as writing automated tests by building it into your code base. So it's all one and the same.
This is part of
Yeah.
Go back into history. I'll go use Zen framework because that's obviously the project I know best.
Uh-huh.
In ZF1, the docs were in the same repo as the code base.
Yep.
And we rejected pull requests if there weren't docs for the thing you were doing. If you didn't supply docs, your code didn't get it. So the docs, whilst they may not have been the best docs, it did actually cover everything that we actually, all the features we had in the code base.
God, I wish ZF2s had done that.
ZF2, we put the docs in a separate repo.
Yeah.
There's an awful lot of stuff in Zen Framework 2's code base that was not documented for months or years later.
And some of it's still
It was
undocumented.
a really, really bad decision. And you'll notice with Zen Framework 3, the docs are back as part of the code base for each component because we identified this problem.
Yeah.
It's frustrating that we had to go through it to find this out. Another comment whilst I'm thinking about it.
Right.
Zen Framework also has the separate versions of the documentation. So
Yeah.
you can see version 1.10's documentation, next to 1.11's documentation, next to 1.12's documentation. You Google for a Zen Framework method, it will show you 1.5's. It did for years.
Why was that?
Because it was the oldest and had the most authority.
Yeah.
So we went through a whole series around 1.9ish where everyone was not knowing we had these new features in any given component because they were reading the old ones. And we ended up writing code where if you came from Google, we dropped you to the latest